Greetings to the anointed. When an adversary is making a mistake, never interrupt them. Bonaparte, Napoleon. I'm about to say something that will touch you differently, so pay careful attention. At one point, the tables don't simply turn. They flip so forcefully that the room becomes quiet. Now is the time. And you know what? Not only did you win the game, you studied it, deciphered it, and perfected it. Inadvertently, even the players who were attempting to undermine you began applauding. This is a fact. The backfire effect is a phenomena that has been studied in psychology. It occurs when someone makes a concerted effort to disprove you and ultimately succeeds in doing so. This is precisely what took place. You remained in place, moving with heavenly accuracy as if it were all part of a covert operation, even when others planned, murmured, and even hurled shade in HD. During their villain monologue, they are now frozen like Wi-Fi, silent, and unable to speak. You were the plot twist that the individuals who believed they could control the story failed to recognize. With a single move and a grin, you checkmate their whole lineage after giving them the impression that you were losing. Did anybody else hear that, by the way? Fake individuals choking on their own karma snacks was the sound that was heard. Hold on tight, because we're going to explain in detail how you outplayed the whole circus key while they were too preoccupied with flinging bananas at one another to notice that you were the zookeeper holding the keys the entire time. Let's get started. First of all, you allowed them to undervalue you. That was the cost of admission. You allowed them to undervalue you, and you could not have done it more wisely. They perceived someone who was reserved, uncertain, soft-spoken, and maybe even disoriented when they glanced at you. They believed they were interacting with a person who was ignorant of the world, and you allowed them to believe that because you knew the power of deception, not because you were weak. They began lowering their defenses the once they believed they had you figured out. You started winning at that point. They were unaware that they were showing you their hand. Every snide remark, every sidelong glance, every phony grin. They believed they were in charge, so they gave themselves up. You saw their actions, their deception, and their grouping together to feel more powerful. And you were taking notes while they performed for their little crowd. You didn't respond. You were watching. You had that edge. You remained silent and composed, not because you were voiceless, but rather because you were anticipating every move they made and every vulnerability they revealed. In fact, the majority of them believed you to be innocuous. You were dangerous because of it. They were unaware that you were the most erratic player on the board. They believed you to be a pawn. But when they get to the opposite side, pawns turn into queens. They're trembling now that you've come because they realize they can't return you to where you were before. Nothing was faked by you. You just won't do it. Because you believed they had the advantage, you allowed them to fall into their own trap. However, you were 5 steps ahead the whole time. They are now unable to speak because of this. Not just because you were successful, but also because they were caught off guard. They have no idea how you accomplished it. They just realized that their attempt to manipulate you was a failure. The nicest thing is that you never had to speak louder. Your worth has increased. Second, rather than being insecure, your humility was calculated. You weren't weak because you were humble. It was an unfamiliar weapon to them. Because you didn't compete, boast, or battle for attention, they assumed you were insecure. They were unaware, however, that you were never looking for attention. Alignment was your main concern. You already knew who you were. Therefore, there was no need in demonstrating anything to anybody. It isn't insecure. Discipline is that. They were continuously reminding everyone of their alleged worth while they were out there trying to get attention. You were constructing in silence. They were displaying branches, and you were planting roots. Because they were more noticeable, louder, and flashier, they believed they were winning. However, your composure was what held you upright throughout the storms. They thought you were self-conscious. In actuality, you just didn't feel the need to market yourself to those who couldn't initially afford your presence. To ensure that you were seeing the whole cycle, you remained in lodgings that you had obviously outgrown, that told you all you needed to know, so you wanted to see who would speak over you, disregard your knowledge, and act as if they were unaware of your talents. You didn't play tiny out of modesty. It was about being clever. While they were exhausting themselves attempting to impress individuals who weren't even looking, you were conserving your energy. The same individuals who believed you were gullible are now attempting to find out how you managed to go past them without making any noise. They fail to understand. They don't comprehend how someone so reserved might succeed so well. In actuality, however, you were never silent. You did that on purpose. You weren't hiding. Something holy was under your protection. Since you were never in their race in the first place, they are now discovering that they underestimated the one person who never needed to compete. Third, while they were chasing plaudits, you were playing the long game. While others pursued short-term gains, you played the long game, and you're ahead today for just that reason. They didn't even understand they were burning out for a fleeting high because they were so preoccupied with seeking out immediate recognition, likes, acclaim, and affirmation. Being noticed was the goal of all they did. Every performance, every theatrical exhibition, every post was an appeal for attention. Additionally, their addiction to attention grew as they acquired more. However, you remained quiet throughout the process, kept your development hidden, and concentrated on something far greater than a single instant. You were creating something durable. You were aware that you shouldn't hurry your time. You weren't only attempting to get recognition. You were attempting to solidify. You realized that fame isn't the foundation of real success. The foundation of it is preparation. Additionally, that kind of preparation is often disregarded and requires patience and time. You were gaining true depth while others were rejoicing in trivial triumphs. You were laying the groundwork for an unshakable foundation. Even if others attempted to dull your brightness, made fun of you, or ignored you, they were louder, so they believed they were in the lead. Because you didn't display everything, they assumed you were behind. They were unaware, however, that you were prioritizing purpose above output. You were allowing your roots to get deeply ingrained so that you would not only ascend but also endure when the time came. That's what's going on right now. They are frantically trying to maintain the attention they formerly pleaded for. During the moment, you remain unfazed and unmoved. You had no intention of becoming viral. Your goal was to become timeless. There's nothing they can do to stop it now that you're coming. Since it's not hype, it's not luck. This is the outcome of making the decisions to remain focused when no one was looking, to be consistent when no one was applauding, and to have faith in the process even when it seemed sluggish. That's why you prevailed. They were dancing for applause while you were playing chess. Fourth, you are an expert at regulated exposure. They couldn't take you down in part because you were an expert at controlled exposure. You were aware from a way that not everyone should have access to your true self. As a result, you provided them bits and pieces, fragments they might nibble on, but never the whole image. As a result, they committed a deadly error. They didn't realize you were functioning on a level that was much above their comprehension, so they made their judgments based on what they believed they saw. You allowed people to make assumptions. You allowed them to categorize you. You allowed them to put you in positions that suited their egos. You were deemed too gentle by some. You were seen as sluggish by others. Some even believed you had no strategy. They were unaware, however, that you want for them to believe that. You had cover because of that poor decision. You had time. You have the element of surprise because of that. They were unable to combat something they did not comprehend. Furthermore, they were unable to stop something they did not foresee. You weren't hiding. You were making choices. Use your energy selectively. Selective when you're around. Because you understood the importance of mystery, you were selective with your genius. Additionally, the real you had already surpassed their reach by the time they saw that the version of you they had been reacting to was only about 10% of your potential. You had already taken action, moved into an area they couldn't reach, much less control. They were really playing chess with someone who had previously seen the whole board, but they always felt they were one step ahead of you. They were unaware that you were being surgical with your timing, purposeful with your disclosures, and purposeful with your quiet. They're now stuck attempting to figure out how you managed to move so quickly and far without ever revealing your whole hand. However, that's the problem. There was never anything you had to prove. Your growth speaks for you. And their delusion of control was shattered by that stillness, that mystery, and that domination. Fifth, you reverse-engineered their game rather than only surviving it. While they believed you were having trouble keeping up, you not only survived their game, but you also reverse-engineered it. They thought you were psychologically and emotionally broken, barely surviving, and just hanging on. In reality, however, you were analyzing every move, strategy, and psychological ploy they used from their same old playbook. You weren't passive, but you were silent. You were observing, taking in, and gathering information in real time. All of the manipulation, guilt trips, and passive-aggressive behaviors weren't just assaults. They were instructive, and you picked them up quickly. They were unaware that their brutality had turned into your school, that you were analyzing patterns while they were practicing treachery. You saw their use of silence as a means of control, how they feigned care while gaslighting you. After playing the villain, they played the victim. In order to keep up a fiction in which they were always correct and you were always incorrect, you saw how they moved in packs and co-signed each other's falsehoods. They weren't only poisonous. In their dysfunction, they were coordinated. You continued to be 2 steps ahead. You didn't just put up with the mayhem. The underlying code began to make sense to you, and you wasted no time whining when you figured out the scheme. You turned it over. You used every unfounded charge as fodder. You redirected with each dismissal. You utilized their attempt to confine you as a model to completely break free. You made your own world and quit following their rules, one in which their tactics couldn't affect you and their ideas were powerless. Everything they formerly used to control you is now ineffective, leaving them bewildered, defenseless, and helpless. Before it even begins, you can see it coming. It doesn't land the guilt. You are not shaken by the drama. The lies are untrue. After disassembling the machine, you took the blueprint and left. It isn't survival. Mastery is that. 6th, your silence did not constitute compliance. Strategic encryption was used. It wasn't fear that kept you silent. It was accurate. You weren't giving in. You locked in. They couldn't understand a strength that doesn't need noise, so they saw your silence as weakness. In actuality, however, you were using a whole other frequency, one that they were never intended to use. You were encrypting everything that was important while they were rushing their words, revealing their plans, and attempting to take over the room. Your ideas, your suffering, your method, and your goal. They couldn't get beyond the spiritual firewall you set in place. They thought they had won since you didn't say anything. They thought it indicated that you were lost, confused, or broken. In actuality, however, you were more concentrated than ever. You were aware that not everything required defense, explanation, or announcement. So you remained silent, and you created everything out of that nothing. While they tried to read you like an open book, you developed methods, healed in secret, advanced spiritually, and outgrew their whole framework. You were never a book, however. Your code was encrypted. They were attempting to identify you from observations at the surface level. Although you moved in layers, they believed they had you mapped. You become unpredictable in stillness. You left them with insufficient information to track. Since you never disclosed what you were doing, they were unable to foresee what would happen. And the launch had already taken place by the time they understood you had been preparing something huge the whole time. The doors were already open. They were no longer able to control the version of you. Your armor was that quiet. It prevented the ruin of your aspirations. It provided you with unhindered space to think, breathe, and develop. You didn't remain silent because you had nothing to say. Because of the holy nature of what you were constructing, you remained silent. They're shocked that you didn't simply remain silent now that it's out there, and they can see what resulted from the silence they ridiculed. You remained invincible. 7th, you didn't need retribution. You turned into the indisputable evidence. Since your development revealed all they attempted to hide, you didn't require retribution. They anticipated that you would snap, crumble, and play the same small-minded game as them. However, you didn't. You choose to elevate rather than retaliate. And that choice had a greater impact than any possible resurgence. They awaited the breakdown, the explosion, and the drama. Instead, they had achievement followed by stillness. They were more shaken by it than by any argument. They misrepresented you as unstable, undeserving, phony, and crazy. They forced others to see you through their prism and misrepresented your tale. This is the unexpected part, however. In order to rectify their story, you didn't fight. You just continued to construct the authentic one. That version is now indisputable. They watch you flourishing, developing, and sparkling, and they don't understand a thing. How could someone they attempted to bury blossom in this way? Your life turned into the clapback. That's why. The evidence was your progress. You turned into tangible proof that their story was untrue. You didn't just go on. You advanced in style. Every fresh start you take, every healed wound they said would shatter you. There is a silent explosion in their universe every time you get up without calling them by name. The evidence that they were mistaken about everything is you. Even those they deceived are now beginning to doubt the account. Because how can someone who is so shattered be so radiant? How is it possible for someone so weak to have this type of power? They failed to remember that truth doesn't shout. It just appears. Additionally, you're acting in a manner that silences any accusations, rumors, and covert campaigns against you. You did not allow them to destroy you, not because you attempted to destroy them. And you were unstoppable because of your unwillingness. Retaliation wasn't your choice. You decided on revelation. Where they said you would never rise again, the truth now stands. You were usually 10 steps ahead, number 8. You just allowed them to believe that you weren't. You were 10 steps ahead at all times. Simply enough, they were unaware that their opponent had already seen the denouement. You saw their movements, their speech, and their repetition of the same old strategies, believing that no one was paying attention. But you saw it everything. The phony worry, the calculated rumors, and the way they seemed to be friendly in order to get information. You saw everything because you were there, not because you were paranoid. They were surprised at how attentive you were. You were taking mental snapshots the whole time, but they believed you to be naive. They believed they were being cunning and attempted to test you. However, you were previously aware of every test they administered. You anticipated the betrayal before they even made the commitment. Gaslighting. Before the untruth even came out of their lips, you saw the diversion. The sabotage. Knowing that they were standing on the brink of the hole themselves, you allowed them to dig it. You weren't surprised. As if you had read the screenplay, you were seeing the inevitable play out. You didn't flinch, however. You gave them the impression that they were winning. You continued to smile because you were beyond the point they believed you would break, not because you were oblivious. You maintained your composure because you understood that time would soon take care of the tough work for you, not because you lacked fire. They believed they were ahead. They were unaware that you weren't responding. You were giving in. You provided them with just enough space to reveal themselves and enough quiet to accommodate their own cacophony. It was too late by the time they realized you weren't taken by surprise. Already, their scheme was collapsing due to their own carelessness. You didn't have to outsmart them. You allowed them to walk right into the problems they caused. That is what foresight is all about. That's the art of letting the game unfold naturally, even if they never had control over the result in the first place. At number 9, you learned to move like light by studying the shadows. You studied the shadows because you realized that there was knowledge concealed in what others fled from, not because you were engrossed in them. The dark aspects of life, such as treachery, jealousy, and manipulation, were dreaded by most people, but you confronted them head-on and remained calm when the tide turned. When people's masks were uncovered, you didn't flee. You paid careful attention. You saw envy masquerading as support. You saw how some folks held a knife behind their back with one hand while hugging you with the other. You deciphered the shadows, not simply noticed them. You started to see how individuals use love for their own ends. How shame may be imposed via silence. How sabotage may be set up by seeming to be friendly. All of it had the potential to ruin you, but it didn't, because you weren't taking it in. You were examining it. You came to see that darkness is more than simply a danger. It's a teacher, too. And since it did, you took notes as if your future relied on them. They believed you were drowning, stranded, and alone. In actuality, however, you were learning how to flow through energy without experiencing its effects. They believed that your judgment would be impaired by their disarray. They were unaware that you were delving so deeply into the architecture of their dysfunction that it honed your intuition to an untouchable degree. You get clear immediately instead of being rattled. You move with the accuracy of someone who has previously braved a storm without shoes and emerged with a steely skeleton. They are terrified by your capacity to see right through them, since they are unable to conceal themselves behind the deceptions they used on everyone else. You are suddenly unstoppable, swift, clear, and cutting like light. The same shadows that believed they would stifle your development are now powerless to overtake you. You're more than just healed. Because you learned from the darkness without becoming it, you are dangerous in the greatest manner possible. Nothing phony can now stand in your presence because of this. 10. Power was not what you sought. You silently embraced it till it reverberated. You were strong because you never sought power. You were doing something completely different while they were busy attempting to rule every room, yell the loudest, and impose respect via dominance. You were silently embracing power. No one needed to be persuaded. There was no need for you to perform. What was already inside of you was validated without the need for a spotlight. They were perplexed by such calm certainty. They were unable to understand why you didn't compete, why you didn't respond, and why you didn't make an effort to prove anything. They were uneasy because they felt in their hearts that they were standing close to someone whose presence was uncontrollable. They believed that power was about terror, intimidation, and domination. But you were wiser. You realized that true power has roots. When pressed, it remains unflinching. To be felt, it doesn't have to be loud. Therefore, you moved intentionally while they yelled to be noticed. More than you spoke, you listened. You didn't move on instinct, you had a goal. And gradually, that quiet began to create sound. They couldn't describe the change in the environment that you became. The subdued presence that caused manipulators to falter, liars to feel uneasy, and false people to become anxious. Your presence began to reveal the things they were attempting to conceal. They began to worry at that point. Your sincerity began to make their acts seem absurd, not because you attacked. To be strong, you didn't need a stage. All you needed was time. And now what you've been holding all along has come to light. You didn't just climb, and that's why they're rattled. You caused a disturbance. You weren't simply there. You changed the whole story. They didn't anticipate it. They were too preoccupied with making fun of things they couldn't quantify. However, your silent strength's aftershocks are now disintegrating. Every falsehood, gossip, and delusion they created about you. The nicest thing is that you never had to speak louder. Your enthusiasm spoke for you. 11. To hang themselves, you allowed them to construct a case against you. They were able to construct a case against you. They also have a lot of confidence in their setup. They were certain that, in frustration, you would snap, strike out, or expose yourself. They collected half-truths, fabricated proof, and misrepresented your statements as facts. They strive to paint a picture of you that is simpler to despise and ignore by spreading tales like wildfire. But you remained still rather than responding. You took your time clearing your name. You didn't try to convince them of your veracity. You allowed them to speak. And you remained steadfast in your truth while they were erecting that disorganized tower of falsehoods. Your silence was incomprehensible to them. They mistook that for guilt, but it was a tactic. You were aware that falsehoods fall apart on their own. You were aware that they would ultimately overplay their hand if they were serious enough about lying. And they did. They lost all self-control because they were so determined to ruin you. The falsehoods became larger, more absurd, and more difficult to sustain. They were exposing themselves, even if they believed they were exposing you. The truth didn't need a lawyer, therefore you didn't have to defend yourself. All it took was time. During that period, the mask started to come off. The discrepancies became apparent. They began to get inquiries from those they were trying to attract. Suddenly, the case they constructed turned into a monument to their own hatred and insecurity. God used their whole narrative as a stage to exalt you rather than embarrass you. What they intended to use to destroy you is now being utilized to show off your innocence, strength, and fortitude. They are now choking on their own story. Even they are unable to keep up with the tale anymore. Therefore, the same falsehoods they propagate are coming back to haunt them in the worst manner. And you're rising because you allowed the truth to be your defense, not because you fought nasty. They attempted to tie the rope around your name, but you let them to hang themselves with it. That isn't retaliation. That is the manifestation of divine justice. 12. They were unable to cope with their own image once you turned into their mirror. Because you became their reflection, people found it unbearable to be near you. It wasn't because you did anything wrong, but rather because they felt vulnerable every time you entered the room. You didn't strive to minimize them. You didn't make fun of them. You didn't say anything about what you saw. However, your very presence compelled them to face the things they had avoided throughout their lives. You didn't need to blame anybody. The contrast alone was loud enough. You brought to mind all of the things they had buried, the hopes they had abandoned, the lies they had concealed, and the morals they had exchanged for acceptance. You were in charge, confident, and secure, whereas they were not. They were enraged by it. You didn't pretend to be confident. You were its embodiment. You didn't seek approval. You walked with dignity. People who are used to wearing masks are disturbed by that type of stuff. They felt uneasy because they had to face the aspects of themselves they couldn't tolerate when they looked at you. They were unable to confront their own inadequacies, so they projected them onto you. When all you did was establish limits, they labeled you arrogant. When all you did was trust in yourself, they labeled you insane. You just refused to shrink, which is why they labeled you tough. In reality, however, it wasn't about you. It has to do with your reflection. In a world that feeds on filters, you were the unvarnished truth. They attempted to undermine you for that reason, because they wouldn't have to face themselves if they could discredit you. However, it got more difficult for them to fake the more you remained true to yourself. Their shadows were uncovered by your light. Their delusions were broken by your genuineness. And since the truth you carried made their falsehoods hard to live with, they decided to detest you rather than rise with you. They weren't broken by you. In an attempt to get away from the mirror you became, they shattered themselves. 13. You were the only one who braved the flames. They are now pleading to be in your light. You were the only one who braved the flames. No safety net, no backup, and no applause. Simply you, your suffering, your prayers, and an amount of stress that would have destroyed a normal person. When things became hard, the same folks who said they cared were nowhere to be seen. Some even questioned your value behind your back, muttered about your shortcomings, and laughed at your struggles. They were curious, not worried, as they watched you bleed. They saw your loneliness as weakness and your quiet as defeat. However, they had no idea what was going on in that fire. You were being honed while they were counting you out. What they saw as a breakdown turned out to be your secret breakthrough. Every tear, every failure, and every moment of loneliness shaped you into someone they can't replicate. You changed, not just survived. Your brightness emanated from the same fire they believed would devour you. They're suddenly circling back now that you've emerged, your power unidentifiable. They want to stand next to you now. They can now recall your name. But love isn't the source of their attention. It stems from fear. Fear of what your success says about them, not fear of you harming them. Because you are more than simply a shining star. It reveals. It reveals who abandoned you when you were in despair. It reveals who claps just when they're in front of you. Instead of encouraging you, it reveals others who saw your hardship and used it for gossip. And they want to claim affiliation now that you're radiating your mission. The falsehoods they told about you are threatened by your existence, not because they have changed. They want to reap the rewards of your genius without having to bear the hardships of your path. In actuality, however, they are not allowed to walk in your light and avoid the flames. Not now, because you now understand the difference between leeching and loving. You can now plainly see who stood by you and who was solely interested in bringing you down. And your shine is impenetrable because of your clarity. 14. You turned into the conclusion they had not anticipated. You turned into the conclusion they didn't anticipate. They had everything arranged. How you would shatter, how you would tumble, how you would vanish in silence, and how you would never be seen again. As if they had the power to foretell your destiny. They had practiced their speeches, prepared their phony pity, and were prepared to proclaim, "I knew it." They believed they were your story's narrators and future editors. They were planning your demise, but they were unaware that you were stealthily taking back the pen. You gave them the impression that they had the last word. You allow others to speak, make assumptions, and spread their diluted version of your identity. But you were revising things behind the scenes, not dramatically or loudly, but wisely, discreetly, and with might. They were at a loss for words when you came out, not shattered, not bitter, but reborn. Without even addressing the story, you destroyed it. They vowed to bury you, but you turned into the narrative twist that destroyed the script. They continued to wait for the accident, but you turned into the uncontrollable storm. You didn't just escape their assaults. You went beyond them. They didn't believe that someone like you could level up in the manner that you did. Where they believed you would always be hurt, you healed. Without permission, you created a new reality. And because it goes against everything they said about you, they're now frantically trying to adapt to your existence. The version that they made no longer fits you. You surpassed their time frames, exceeded their expectations, and outlived their presumptions. Their mouths are hanging wide as they attempt to comprehend how the tale changed without their involvement. They will never accept that portion. They weren't necessary for your victory. To climb, you didn't need their approval. You turned into the conclusion they dreaded. A version of you that they cannot foresee, control, or, most importantly, deny. You had a very different experience with the game, outwitting every trap, figuring out every plan, and getting up while they were still mired in the past in silence. They used deception, coercion, and uncertainty to try to stop you. However, you used every assault as fuel for your inexorable ascent. You didn't have to comply with their demands. You forged your own course and followed it with a fortitude others were unable to understand. As you flourish beyond the boundaries they attempted to establish, they are now rendered incomprehensible. This goes beyond just survival. It's mastery. It's the strength of perseverance, forethought, and unflinching faith in oneself. Their commotion just served to accentuate your radiance, since you represented a power that was so profound and true. They created their stories with the expectation that you would fail, but you changed the whole plot so that you are the winner rather than the victim. Keep in mind that the people who attempted to restrain you were also the ones who misjudged the depth of your soul. Now, their bewilderment and silence demonstrate one certain fact: you were destined to succeed. The game has changed, so keep your chin up. And the reason for it is you. It's not only you who won. It's a message for anybody who has ever questioned the effectiveness of quiet strength and purposeful action. Continue on with the same fervor and concentration. You are the creator of your own legacy, even if the world may have attempted to write your demise. And this is just the first step. Don't keep this message to yourself if it resonated with you. Click subscribe to become a part of the community that is changing the rules. To demonstrate that you are prepared to overcome any obstacle, hit the like button. Additionally, leave a comment below with your experience or the section that most affected you. Your voice counts. We're unstoppable when we work together. Additionally, remember to share this video with anybody who needs to hear that they're doing a fantastic job at their game. Let's raise each other up and share this enthusiasm. Your next level is just around the corner. Thus, continue to win, remain focused, and stay connected. May you be blessed.